you say that evolution is a proven fact?
Yes. Absolutely not.
I repeat, Allah, God Himself, will visit Brother Wallace Muhammad.
You are watching the Black Muslim Convention in Chicago in 1975. The man Muhammad Ali said Allah would visit is my guest. Welcome to the John Ankerberg Show. Tonight, we're going to have a non-Christian guest, one of the top scientists in our country, debating another one of the top scientists in our country on the problem and the question of evolution versus creation. One is a non-Christian, one is going to be a Christian. And we're going to ask them to present the facts that support their theory. I think you're going to enjoy this program. Let me introduce to you my guests. They are Dr. Vincent M. Sarich. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and he now teaches at Berkeley the introductory courses in human evolution, human variation, and molecular evolution. My second guest is Dr. Duane Gish, who received his PhD in biochemistry from Berkeley. He also taught at Cornell University and has, while he was there, worked with 2 Nobel Prize winners in medicine. He is now the Associate Director of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, California. In the weeks to come, these men are going to be debating this topic from different angles. For example, tonight, they're going to be setting out their case, introductory remarks, if you will, about the theory of creation and the theory of evolution. Next week, we're going to be talking about how did life originate? What does the scientific evidence say? Then we're going to be talking about what about the fossil evidence? What does the fossil record show? Does it support evolution or does it support creation? After that, we're going to be talking about ape to man. Dr. Sarich did his PhD work in this area, and I think you'll find it very enlightening. Also, after that, we're going to go to genetic mutations. What about them? Is this the area that supports evolution or takes away from it? Then we're going to have questions and answers from the audience that you'll be meeting tonight. Each week on the John Ankerberg Show, again, we have guests, and we try to take our Christianity into the arena of the world's ideas and let the evidence for Christianity talk to all people. I hope that you'll enjoy the program tonight. While you see the different segments that'll be coming on your screen, we have a phone number. If you'd like to comment on the program, we invite you to call. We have staff standing by. We also ask that if you're a Christian, if you're not a Christian, I'm not talking to you, but if you're a Christian, that you help support the program. Maybe you could pledge a certain amount of money each week. If so, would you call right now? All right, let's go to the first segment where Dr. Duane Gish will be talking and presenting the creation model. We're going to be asking Dr. Duane Gish to give us the essence of the creation model. What is the basis for creationism? Where is he coming from? And he's going to give us his platform right now. Dr. Gish?
My scientific studies from various fields of science has convinced me that the Darwinian theory of evolution is scientifically untenable. It violates the laws of thermodynamics. It certainly is untenable in the light of the laws of probability and is emphatically contradicted by the fossil record itself. Now, of course, if we disprove evolution, does not necessarily prove creation, but certainly creation is the only alternative. We are convinced that the universe could not have created itself by any natural process. Therefore, it must have been created supernaturally by something external to the natural universe. Creation is the only reasonable alternative. Increasing numbers of scientists, as a matter of fact, are abandoning their belief in evolution in favor of spatial creation. And undoubtedly, hundreds of thousands of students are becoming convinced that creation offers a better model to explain origins than does evolution. Even increasing numbers of scientists who are evolutionists are telling us today that the modern theory of evolution cannot be correct. They believe in evolution, they cannot turn to creation as an alternative, but they realize that this modern theory is impossible. Pierre Grasset, for example, a French scientist whose knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic, who's the most distinguished of all French zoologists, says that flatly that this idea of mutations with natural selection absolutely cannot account for the origin of the living things that we have today. And he says biology simply cannot give us the answer. We just don't know, and we may never know how evolution has occurred. Dr. Murray Eden, who's a professor at MIT and an evolutionist, subjected the theory of evolution, the modern theory, to a test versus the laws of probability. And he and other mathematicians who are also evolutionists came up with the conclusion that it would take billions of times longer than 5 billion years to convert a single-cell organism into a man or a moth or a tiger or something like that, according to the modern theory. You couldn't do it even billions of times longer than 5 billion years. Evolution is actually a philosophy parading as science. Now, as a matter of fact, of course, neither creation nor evolution are scientific theories. Of course, science involves what you can see and what you can test. And obviously that cannot be done. No, there were no human observers to the origin of the universe, the origin of life, or as a matter of fact, to the origin of a single living thing. So neither creation nor evolution are really scientific theories. And in that sense, then of course, evolution is certainly just as religious as creation. As I've mentioned, it is a philosophy, but it parades as science, and it's certainly supported with great fervor today. And it is a basic dogma of humanism and atheism and agnosticism. The American Humanist Association defines humanism as a non-theistic religion. And in their literature, they quote Sir Julian Huxley, who says that a humanist is one who believes that man is not a product of a supernatural creator, but he's a product of evolution. And so we see then that evolution is used to support that sort of philosophy. Now, not all evolutionists have that philosophy, of course, but it is being used to convince millions of our young people that there is no God, that they're simply a mechanistic product of a mindless universe, and that is one of the main motivations for us as scientists to demonstrate certainly the scientific superiority of creation. Now, the paleontologists themselves, those who study the fossil record, are now admitting really that there is no evidence for transitional forms or for gradual change. For example, one of these scientists is Stephen Jay Gould, professor at Harvard University, who teaches biology and geology at Harvard University, one of the leading spokesmen for evolutionists. And he says there is no evidence for gradual change in the fossil record. And he's suggesting a return to the hopeful monster mechanism of Richard Goldschmidt of a quarter of a century ago. Goldschmidt said, well, there's no transitional forms. Everything appears instantaneously fully formed. No evidence of gradual change. But he wouldn't give up faith in evolution. So he suggested, for example, at one time a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. So you went from the reptile to the bird, just like that, and that's why we don't have any transitional form. Well, now, certainly, if people like Stephen Jay Gould, this famous professor at Harvard University, is desperate enough to suggest such an incredible idea, something that's genetically impossible, if he's that desperate, it means only one thing. They cannot find the transitional forms that are demanded by gradual change, so they're seeking an answer some other way. Our space program has been tremendously helpful to the creationists and has produced some tremendous problems for evolutionists. For example, we are finding that every planet is unique, even though they supposedly evolved from the same cloud of dust and gas. Yet we are finding that they are different and very unique. The isotope ratios of various compounds are so different on Venus and Mars and the Earth and other planets that it's incredible to believe that they all evolved from one single cloud of dust and gas. The Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe, which was solidified into dogma in the last 10 years, in just the last year or two has fallen on bad times. We are finding scientific contradictions with this idea. For example, just recently, there was a report of a massive cluster of galaxies out in space. There in a particular part of our universe is this massive concentration of matter, massive cluster of galaxies. Now, according to the Big Bang theory, of course, matter would be scattered in all directions and in rather homogeneous fashion. But here's that massive cluster of galaxies, certainly contradicting the idea of the Big Bang. And just yesterday, I was reading an article in the paper that they'd found certain stars in our Milky Way galaxy which were very deficient in the heavy elements. And this was a totally unexpected development. They had expected to find certain heavy elements there, supposedly produced in the side of stars and then spread out through supernova.
30 seconds left.
No evidence for this was found. And what we are finding in biology today, the incredible complexity of DNA synthesis and the differences between different organisms as far as that synthesis is concerned, certainly is making it more and more difficult to support the idea that there's been an evolutionary origin from a common ancestor. I think, undoubtedly, the evidence demands creation.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and hear the evolutionist model, where he's coming from, right after this. Welcome back, and now we're going to have Dr. Vincent Sarich, anthropology professor, PhD from Berkeley, to give us the evolutionary model.
Now, evolution is basically an idea. And the idea of a world in a continual state of flux is really not a very new one in human thought. It's basic to numerous religions, although not Western religions. As I said, it is therefore rather new to the Western world. And the concept then of organic evolution made for a real revolution in our ways of thinking. The set of ideas itself evolved, mainly in Great Britain, from toward the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th. And the evolution of the idea of evolution stemmed from considerations of the meaning of the geological record, from considerations about the age of the earth and of life upon it, and from speculations concerning the nature of the relationships between the various forms of life that we see today, and also those which are evident in the fossil record, but which are now extinct. The basic tenets of evolution: first, the Earth is billions of years old. This, I would say, we know unequivocally from considerations of radioactive decay. But even before radioactivity was discovered in the late 19th century, it became clear to many people that, even earlier, that we had to think in terms of tens and hundreds of millions of years to produce the sort of geological record that we find. And second, that ultimately all forms of life, living and extinct, stem from a single common ancestral form. Now, these first two I would put under the label of observation plus conclusion. The third one is a question of interpretation, explanation as to how and why this might have happened. And basically, the idea is that variation is introduced by mutations. No one denies that mutations occur. That the mutations occur at random, and that a mutation which gives the individual carrying it an advantage will be passed on preferentially to his descendants carrying that mutation. And in this fashion, the mutation, if it's favorable, will tend to survive. If it's unfavorable, of course, it will die out. Now, the disagreements that we have between quote-unquote evolutionists on one side and creationists on the other side, I think are very artificial. Most religions either really don't care about the idea of evolution one way or the other, or are more or less happy with it. It is, I would say, only a certain relatively narrow core of fundamentalists, if that isn't a dirty word around here, who have their real problems with the idea of evolution. Now, I don't have any problems with the idea of creation, provided it is a creation which is consistent with what we observe in the geological record. And the point is that a model of creation which is entirely consistent with everything we observe and which is not falsifiable was in fact proposed prior to the introduction of Darwinian evolution by the publication of Origin of Species in 1859. And this was proposed by a man named Philip Gosse in 1857 in a book titled Omphalos, or Navel, N-A-V-E-L, an attempt to untie the geological knot. I brought a copy along. And what Gosse said was, well, he was looking at the evidence as it was mounting during the early years of the 19th century. And he said, really, I have to look at the world as if it had evolved. And yet, I want to be a good Christian and also believe in the biblical account of creation. How can I do this? And Gosse said, look, let's imagine a creation event. Let's imagine the creation of Adam. And let's imagine the creation of a tree. Now, a tree would have had to have been created as a functional entity. It had to look like a tree, okay? It had to have rings. But if that tree had been instantly created, it had no history, even though the rings indicated that it really did, okay? Because rings are growth rings, one every year in essence. By the same token, Adam would have had to have been created as a functional adult human being. There wasn't anybody else around to nurture him. Presumably, he would have been created with a navel, although I recognize there's some arguments about that issue. But there's no argument about the fact that he would have had blood and circulating corpuscles and so forth. And the fact that he had blood and corpuscles would, if you were looking at him today, imply that he had some history, because the blood had to be generated in the body and so forth and so on. And so Gosse said, well, look, if the creation event is to make any logical sense to us at all, it then has to be viewed in this manner, that the history that we see, or think we see, okay, is because that's the way it has to be. You can't create individuals without some indication of formation of those individuals, and so forth. Okay? I don't want to expound a 300-page book in 30 seconds, in effect. And so what Gosse said was that looking at it this way, what you're simply doing is reading the record that you see in geology, in the rocks, in the fossils, and so forth, not as things that happened in real time, but as things that happened, if you wish, in the Creator's mind.
About 30 seconds left.
Okay. Now, that sort of model, then, is unbeatable. And if you want to believe in that sort of creation, I have no quarrels with you at all, because it is inevitably consistent with the evidence as we observe it. If you want to believe in the kind of creation model that Dr. Gish is proposing, which we heard very little about, you notice, then I have a great deal to quarrel about. And we'll hear more about that quarrel for the rest of the evening.
All right. I want to close part one of this debate by, first of all, thanking Dr. Vincent Sarich, professor of anthropology at Berkeley, and Dr. Duane Gish, associate director of the Creation Research Institute, for being my guests. Hey, did you hear tonight that the theory of evolution has not been scientifically proven? Well, it is not a scientific fact. Even Dr. Sarich from Berkeley admitted that. Listen.
So the question ultimately comes back to the one we're working with. Where does life come from? Can you get order from original disorder to a sufficient degree so that you can form self-replicating molecules? As I just finished saying, at this stage of the game, I don't know whether you can or not. Because knowing that you could would imply that you knew how it happened. And I just finished saying we don't know. We're a long way from getting to that question.
Obviously, if what he says is true, the theory of evolution is not a proven fact. Now, isn't it amazing how our magazines and newspapers and television have brainwashed us to think that evolution is a proven fact? I know in public, especially in the public schools, if you say you doubt the theory of evolution, you're looked down upon. But the reason it's not doubted is that we don't hear much from the top scientists telling us where the theory breaks down. Well, let me tell you about a symposium, a conference, where leading evolutionary biologists were challenged by mathematicians using high-speed computers at MIT, and they tested the probability of present-day evolutionary theory. Their conclusions were written up in a book entitled Mathematical Challenges to Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. Now, Sir Peter Medawar from the National Institute for Medical Research in London, England, he was the chairman of the conference. And in his opening remarks, he explained the reason for the symposium. He said, "There are objections made by fellow scientists who feel that in the current theory, something is missing. These objections to current neo-Darwinian theory are very widely held among biologists generally, and we must on no account, I think, make light of them. The very fact that we are having this conference is evidence that we are not making light of them." Interesting reading, huh? And there's more. You probably realize that not only Dr. Sarich, but other evolutionists greatly depend on random mutations to bring about the tremendous variation needed to produce all the life forms that now exist, including man. But did you know that even the great evolutionary scientists think that this is where the theory of evolution has big problems? Well, they do. I'll take, for example, Dr. Murray Eden, professor of electrical engineering at MIT, who at the conference that I just mentioned, he delivered a paper entitled Inadequacies of Neo-Darwinian Evolution as a Scientific Theory. In his paper, he commented on the possibilities of random mutations accounting for the great variation evolutionists say have taken place. Now he says, "It is our contention that if random is given a serious and crucial interpretation from a probabilistic point of view, the randomness postulate is highly implausible, and that an adequate scientific theory of evolution must await the discovery and elucidation of new natural laws, physical, physico-chemical, and biological." Now, here is an evolutionary mathematician calculating the probability of a single cell evolving into something as complicated as a man. And then he concludes that his calculations show that the probability of a chance process accomplishing that is 0. After listening to all of this, I hope you won't be so naive as to think evolution is a proven fact of science. You know, maybe you'll even be courageous enough to investigate the creationist model. It's got a lot going for it, including a real God who loves you. Well, we're back again, and here we're going to, in this section of time, ask these men to address themselves to one particular question. That is, when and where did life begin? How did life get here? What's the process, the scientific laws that would support your model? So, Dr. Gish, we're going to give you 5 minutes here before we give it 5 minutes to Vincent Sarich here.
From our study of chemical thermodynamics and kinetics and the other laws of thermodynamics and the laws of probability, we certainly have become convinced as a scientist that life could not have created itself. It's absolutely, I say impossible, flatly impossible, that this incredibly complex living cell could have created itself, that it could have self-assembled, so to speak, from a mixture of simple gases. The rates at which these chemicals are destroyed compared to the rate of formation, say with ultraviolet light or electrical discharges or something like that, we find that they're destroyed at a rate that exceeds their rate of formation by about a million to one. That's just the simple substances, the amino acids and things like that. And then the idea that amino acids could have arranged themselves spontaneously into the correct order to form a protein, and that other substances could have arranged themselves in the correct order to form a DNA and RNA molecule, absolutely contradicts the laws of probability. We see, as a matter of fact, in nature, we see absolutely no tendency for things to go from the complex to the simple, from the disordered state to the ordered state. There's absolutely no tendency in nature for things to go that way. The universal natural tendency is for things to go from order to disorder, from the complex to the simple. We see that about us all the time. The idea then that this universe could have ordered itself and that life could have created itself by natural processes is impossible in view of these natural laws. We believe that this universe and the living things that it contains were created by God, by a supernatural creator external to the natural universe, the one who created the natural universe, the one therefore who created these natural processes. Certainly it could not have happened naturally, therefore it had to happen supernaturally. And these exercises that certain chemists have performed in the laboratory, supposedly related to the origin of life, are nothing more than exercises in organic chemistry. Had they not imposed upon those experiments certain conditions which never could have existed on the hypothetical primitive Earth, then they would have never succeeded in getting anything. And what they do get is rather trivial, as a matter of fact. When we consider this incredibly complex living cell, involving, at the very least, thousands of different kinds of protein and DNA and RNA molecules, involving many, many complex structures, and everything arranged just perfectly coordinated in time and space, the idea that that could have happened by natural processes defies everything we know in science. The idea that life arose by some mechanistic, naturalistic, evolutionary process is not science. It contradicts science. It's a scenario. It's a belief system, but nothing else. I have in my hand a paper published in the Journal of Theoretical Biology in 1977 by Hubert P. Yockey. This man is not a creationist, but he calculated the probability of getting a gene or something like that by chance. And in this paper, published in 1977, he said the longest gene that one could get by chance in 1 billion years would be one single gene coding for a protein of 49 amino acids. One protein of 49 amino acids. He says, obviously, you couldn't get life started with something like that. He says this idea that life has created itself is based on nothing but faith. It is not based on science. And that is my conclusion as a biochemist. Now, I've gone in the laboratory and I have synthesized these things, and I can testify personally it's hard work, even for an organic chemist. With his specialized reagents, his specialized conditions, his highly contrived apparatus, his purposeful steps carefully planned and carried out, even then it's very, very difficult. And the idea that these things could have created themselves by natural processes defies science and is simply nothing but faith. And we find the human body not only contains cells, incredibly complex cells, it contains 30 trillion cells of over 200 different varieties, 12 billion of which are found in our 3-pound human brain, with 120 trillion connections. And the evolutionist says that that's all happened by chance. As Dr. Gish-Sarich has said, by mutations where certainly are random events, or certainly accidents, are called mistakes, And so you and I, with our 120 trillion connections in our human brain, we're just the result of, obviously, trillions of mistakes. These mutations would take an enormous number of those things to create a human being, and that could never happen, even as some evolutionists are acknowledging, in 5 billion years. It couldn't happen in 500 billion years, or as a matter of fact, in 5,000 billion years. So we find this theory to be untenable. Now, if it could not have happened naturally by a mechanistic process, there is only one alternative, and that's creation. And therefore, we believe that the evidence demands creation, since life and the universe could not have created itself. The universe supposedly arose from a mammoth explosion.
30 seconds.
Now,
30 seconds.
have you ever seen an explosion generate order? No, I haven't. Supposedly it generated hydrogen, and then from a cloud of hydrogen, this marvelous, complex, highly ordered universe arose naturally and mechanistically. I find that idea inconceivable in the light of known facts and laws of science.
All right, Dr. Vincent Sarich, your turn to address yourself. How did life begin? What are the processes that you believe science points to that supports the evolutionary model?
I think this is one of the questions that I'm going to address myself to least. I have a certain credo of life. It goes something along the following lines. That I should have the courage to tackle things that I can do something about, and the willpower to ignore those that I can't do anything about, and most important, the wisdom to be able to tell the difference between the two. Now, the question of ultimate origins, that is, where did all of this come from, is one of those things that I hope I have the wisdom to recognize is something that I really can't come to grips with. The question of ultimate origins is such that I, in a sense, can't even conceive, I can't conceive of the nature of an answer to the question. I don't even know how to ask the questions in the right way, in a productive way. And in a perhaps unduly non-philosophical way of thinking about it, I tell myself, if I think about it at all, which I do as little as possible, that either matter or its equivalent energy has always been here, or that a creator has always been here. The creation of matter or energy from nothing, or the creation of a creator from nothing, I can't come to grips with, either one. So as I said, it's one of those things I don't worry about. Now, the origin of life. Now, that is ultimately knowable, although I am not going to pretend that we are anywhere near an answer to that question. Aha, says the Gish-type creationist, you don't know, and I do. The creator created life. This is an answer? Is somehow creating life any better than creating a creator? If a God can be here always, why not life? Personally, I don't like either one of those ideas, but that's neither here nor there. Now, if we look at the intricate mechanisms of DNA structure, DNA replication, protein synthesis, and so forth and so on, and we throw up our hands and we say, this can't have evolved. Well, as a full-blown entity, as we study it today, as those processes are today, we surely didn't get those from scratch. As Darwin himself said a long time ago, thinking about the eye gave him shudders because of the difficulties in conceiving how the complex eyes that we have today could have evolved. But we have to remember that in the land of the blind, one eye is king. The world was originally blind. All we needed is some sort of photoreceptive molecules, of which there are plenty around. And we could have started some reliance on quote-unquote visual processes. Now, can we discern a one eye, so to speak, in a non-replicating world. Well, I don't know that we know how to do that yet. I surely don't. But it takes, well, if one says, I don't know, that doesn't say we can't know. I think that it's kind of a quintessential humanist, if you wish, chutzpah, which would suggest that just because we can't understand it at this time in our rather young history, that we're never going to be able to understand it, and therefore we have to appeal to some sort of supernatural processes which we can't understand either, which you simply have to accept on faith.
60 seconds.
I find it a peculiar kind of humanist arrogance, human arrogance, which assumes human omniscience, that if we don't know it, it's unknowable. This simply conveniently ignores the nature of human knowledge. That is, human knowledge is continually growing. We stand on the shoulders of our predecessors. The question of the origin of life is something that the biochemists are ultimately going to get to, maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in my children's lifetimes, but they're working toward it. And I trust that maybe they'll get there. Maybe they won't. But that won't be because the answer isn't there. It'll probably be because we're just not bright enough at that point in time to develop it.
When we come back, we're going to have a response from Dr. Gish and then a response from Dr. Sarich to Dr. Gish. We'll come right back and get that. In this part of the debate, we're going to have each professor respond to the other concerning the question we just enunciated. And the question that we've been talking about is, how did life begin? And we're going to give 2 minutes to Dr. Gish, and then we're going to give 2 minutes to Dr. Sarich in response right now.
Dr. Sarich, in acknowledging there are difficulties and problems with evolutionary theory, has suggested that it's simply that we don't yet know enough. And there are unanswered questions, of course, and there always will be in science. We acknowledge that. And that's the real problem. Well, I want to say this. It's not what we don't know that troubles me about the theory of evolution. It's what we do know. And that's what gives me a lot of problems with the theory of evolution. We do know. We are well informed concerning the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of probability. And in the light of what we do know about those laws, evolution is impossible. And that is the difficulty. It's not what we don't know. We're not going to change these well-established principles of science, as a matter of fact. These laws, some of these laws are the most well-established laws known in science. If science is science, if natural laws are natural laws, then we find these basic contradictions. And I don't think increased knowledge is going to erase that difficulty. Dr. Sarich also mentioned the eyes. Well, we find that there is no hierarchy of eyes among organisms. Some of the simplest organisms have the most incredibly complex eyes, and some what are supposed to be highly advanced organisms have some rather simple ones. As a matter of fact, they found a trilobite, supposedly became extinct 200 million years ago, that had perfect eyes, perfect, undistorted vision, and they said it's just as if those eyes had been designed by a physicist. So we see then the evidence for design is there, the evidence for purpose is there, and a design demands a designer, and purpose demands an intelligent creator.
Okay.
Well, in Dr. Gish's world, it may. In mine, it doesn't. Dr. Gish is, in a sense, defining the structure of a world, you see, that if he can't understand it within his particular framework, then it's not understandable. Well, as I said, this much chutzpah I don't have, I hope. And on questions like order from disorder, which is one of the main arguments that the creationists of his particular school put forward. Now, you know, and I know, that we get order from disorder all the time. That's what life is all about. So the question ultimately comes back to the one we're working with. Where does life come from? can you get order from original disorder to a sufficient degree so that you can form self-replicating molecules? As I just finished saying, at this stage of the game, I don't know whether you can or not. Because knowing that you could would imply that you knew how it happened. And I just finished saying we don't know. We're a long way from getting to that question.
10 seconds.
But when I look at the record, the geological record, the fossil record, I see evolution. I see change over time. And therefore, I want to try to explain things within the framework that I see from the evidence.
I want to again thank Dr. Vincent Sarich, Professor of Anthropology at Berkeley, and Dr. Duane Gish, Associate Director of the Creation Research Institute, for being my guests on the program. I'd like to close with a question. What do molecules do when left on their own over long periods of time? Think especially of what it must have been like for simple chemical molecules at the beginning of Earth's history. The second law of thermodynamics seems to come in here, and based upon its proven principles in science, as well as the proven principles of science concerning kinetics, shouldn't we absolutely rule out the possibility of a random chance origin of life taking place? Why? Well, because the second law of thermodynamics states that all things left to themselves always tend to go from the complex to the simple, from the organized to the disorganized. Evolution wants it just the opposite. They want the continually building up from the simplest chemical molecules to the more complex chemical arrangements. But all the chemical laws that we know now tell us that simple chemicals could not have evolved into life on its own. And since life is here, doesn't it seem pretty reasonable to say it was created? Dr. Sarich said, we all know that we get order from disorder all the time. That's what life's all about. But wait a minute. That's what life's all about now, but the problem is getting order and life in the first place. How do we get order in life before there was any? That's the question. And he can't answer that, and no evolutionist can answer that one. Now, once you have life, you will see complex chemical molecules, chemical structures breaking down and changing. But remember, then you're working with already present complex living things to do that. Here's an example of what we're talking about. Take a tree seed, one that can sprout on a tree and has many seeds. Now, all by itself, that seed is a living thing. It has life in it. Now, that seed has all the complicated machinery already present in its structure, well, such as photosynthesis, all the genetic apparatus, all the metabolic pathways, all of that is already in existence. And so a seed then can sprout into a tree. But you'll never get the tree without the seed first. You must have the living seed. The problem of the evolutionist is to explain the origin of life in the first place. What's the origin of the seed? That seed will never come about spontaneously from dead, inorganic materials. Does it seem to you that the evolutionists are rather inconsistent? They must reject all the laws of thermodynamics and kinetics in order to show that evolution took place at the beginning of Earth's history. Now that's why creationists have a smile on their face, knowing they don't have to reject all the laws of thermodynamics and kinetics. God created. You'll stay with us. All right, let's go to the first part of this debate where Dr. Sarich is going to open talking about the fossil record.
Now, the fossil record is at once the only direct evidence of evolution. That is, the actual potential ancestors, if in fact evolution did occur, are there and nowhere else. and at the same time extremely frustrating, because 99 point, I don't know how many nines % of the possible record isn't there. Fossilization is an extremely rare event. Just consider how many human beings have been around here for the last X thousands of years, whatever chronology you would prefer, and then consider how many fossils there are. So that the gaps, so to speak, in the fossil record have to be there. I mean, if only 1% of any given bunch of individuals is going to fossilize, and we know the percentage is far less than that, then of course 99% of the quote-unquote intermediate forms aren't going to be there. And it's really much worse than that. For example, we'll talk about apes a little later on, there aren't any fossil chimps, fossil gorillas, fossil gibbons, period. And these aren't imaginary animals. They're around. So that this incompleteness necessarily poses a difficult interpretive problem, particularly when it's allied, as it has to be, with considerations of rates of evolution. Now, Huxley, on the day before the origin of species, wrote to Darwin, and I'll just read this to you. I am prepared to go to the stake, if requisite. I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness. But it also contained a warning. You have loaded yourself with an unnecessary difficulty in adopting the idea that nature does not make leaps so unreservedly. And this problem of forcing oneself into a gradualistic mode of thinking stemmed from two things. First, a reaction against the other side, the creationists who at that time were catastrophists. That is, seeing major extinctions, major new creations, and so forth. And second, ignorance of the nature of genetic change. Now, a mutation is a quantum event. You don't have fractional mutations. You either have no mutation or one mutation. You can't have 1/100th of a mutation or 1/2 a mutation. So that if change over time is ultimately based in the genes, and if it occurs, that's where it has to be based, then the units of change are quantized. They are not gradual, they are quantized. So that if you stick to a gradualistic point of view, you're going to get into trouble, first in terms of the actual record, and second in terms of our increasing knowledge concerning the mechanisms of change available, whether or not you believe change takes place. There are many people, and I think paleontologists have been among the worst offenders, who say, if the facts, that is, the observations, don't agree with the theory, then so much for the facts. The creationists tend to say, the facts of the fossil record don't agree with the theory. So much for the theory. And on the face of it, this is an eminently reasonable argument for intelligent human beings to embrace. The only problem with it is that there has been an unnecessary association, and it's been unnecessary ever since the introduction of modern genetics around 1900, to think of evolution in gradualistic terms. It simply isn't. There is simply no longer any reason, and there hasn't been for 80 years, to insist that evolution has to be a gradualistic process. We know what mutation rates are. We can measure them. And let me just give you a number. If a particular mutation is desired, let's say to solve a particular problem, you have to have one special change, then in a population of 1 million, it will take 100 years for that change to occur. Now, 100 years in geological standards is nothing. So there's plenty of time to do it.
And we'll get Dr. Gish's reply when we come right back. All right, we're going to have Dr. Gish talk about the fossil record. Dr. Gish.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I trust that you noticed that Dr. Sarich spent his 5 minutes apologizing for the scientific evidence. And, well, he should, because we do not find the transitional forms that are demanded by the theory of evolution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are billions and billions of fossils potentially available. There are millions of fossils now in our museums. As a matter of fact, there are 250,000 fossil species in our museums. And that is certainly more than an adequate fossil record to document evolution. As a matter of fact, if you find any fossils at all, you must find these transitional forms. After all, they suppose that millions of species have gradually evolved over hundreds of millions of years of time. Well, practically everything you find should be a transitional form, and so our museums should provide more than adequate evidence for evolution, if it has occurred. On the other hand, if creation has occurred, then the fossils should begin explosively with very highly complex forms of life, and we should expect fossils of the various created kinds without the intermediate forms. Now, what do we actually find in the fossil record? What does the data actually tell us? Well, let us allow the evolutionists to speak. For that, Dr. Solly Zuckerman, a very famous British anatomist who eventually became Lord Zuckerman, spent many, many years studying human origins and the fossil record relating to the origin of man. He's not a creationist, he's an evolutionist. And after all of this work, many, many years of scientific research with a team which rarely numbered less than 4 scientists, he concluded, as we find in his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970, he says on page 64, no scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. End of quote. So he says, well, if we exclude creation, then man must have evolved from an ape-like creature, but if he did, he hasn't left even a trace in the fossil record. Now, that certainly is not what we read in our textbooks, or probably what we'll hear from Dr. Sarich, but certainly this man has done his homework in that field. Dr. Corner, a botanist, an expert on the fossil record of plants and an evolutionist, in an article published in 1961, said, much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology, but I still think that, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation. End of quote. There's an evolutionist. The fossil record of plants does not favor evolution. It favors creation. Dr. David Kitts, certainly an evolutionist, certainly a paleontologist, an expert on the fossil record, in the journal Evolution, volume 28, 1974, said, and I quote, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. End of quote. All right, here's an evolutionist, a paleontologist, and he says, although evolution requires intermediate forms, the fossil record does not produce them. We do not find in that fossil record the actual scientific evidence, the evidence required by evolution. We find that it agrees with creation. Now may we have that first slide. On this first slide, we see the kind of animals found in Cambrian rocks. We find jellyfish, we find worms, we find trilobites, we find sponges, brachiopods, tremendously complex creatures, so complex their origin supposedly required 2 to 3 billion years. They abruptly appear in the fossil record. We have never been able to find an ancestor for any of these creatures. In Precambrian rocks, rocks that are supposedly older, we find microscopic, single-celled bacteria and algae, so we are told. Well, there's a tremendous gap between a microscopic, single-celled, soft-bodied bacteria and these complex creatures. And absolutely no transitional forms have ever been found. There you see the trunk of this evolutionary tree is missing. Have you ever seen a tree without a trunk? That's an impossible tree. This tree exists only in the minds of evolutionists. It does not exist in the fossils. Now, the next slide, we see the fish that supposedly gave rise to the amphibian. In the lower portion of the slide, we see what is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian. Well, you see the fish is a fish. It has fins, wonderfully and marvelously designed for life in the water. The amphibian, on the other hand, has feet and legs, and absolutely no transitional forms between those creatures have ever been found anywhere on the face of the earth. And the fishes themselves, the various kinds of fishes, have appeared abruptly with no transitional forms, no ancestry. Dr. Arrow White, a British professor who's an expert on fishes, he's an evolutionist, he says that every major kind of fish that he knew anything about had their origins firmly based in nothing. And ladies and gentlemen, nothing means nothing, absolutely nothing. And the next slide will show one of the dinosaurs, the Triceratops. The next slide will show, that's a three-horned dinosaur. The next slide, please, shows the Stegosaurus with unusual plates along the back, spikes on the tail, as you see. The next slide will show the duck-billed dinosaur. The next slide will show the Brachiosaurus with his nostrils and the bony dome on top of the head. These are unique creatures. They have unique structures. They each appear abruptly in the fossil record. No ancestors, no transitional form, just as we would precisely expect on the basis of creation. This evidence, then, supports creation. It is what we would predict. We do not need to apologize for the fossil record. We predict it.
We'll have a response from Dr. Sarich when we come back, right after this break. All right, now we're going to have Dr. Sarich's response to Duane Gish's talk on fossils.
I find it a peculiar exercise when honesty gets labeled as an excuse. And I think that the basic problem is the way in which we believe human knowledge is accumulated. Dr. Gish's arguments, as you've noted, and as I've noted in 3 other of our debates, are remarkably data-free. What people say is not data. He's playing the authority figure game. He's appealing to quote-unquote authorities who are expressing one or another certain doubts, certain admissions of their lack of knowledge, and so forth and so on. That is not the way we gain knowledge. I explained to you not that intermediate forms were completely lacking, but the percentage of intermediate forms that we should find relative to the number that must have been there is going to be very small. And it will become even smaller when one measures the length of time that a species exists against the length of time that it takes from one species to change into another one. The latter time is very brief, the former time is very long. Even so, there are plenty of intermediate forms around. And the only way you can avoid recognizing them is if you choose to play a game of semantics. Clearly, if you have one category reptile and another category bird, then by definition you can't have an intermediate form because you don't have a word for it.
Time's up.
That is not the way we play the science game.
Okay. Dr. Gish, we'll have your response in this area of fossils.
I find it strange if we're criticized for quoting authorities, because evolutionists, of course, use authorities against creation. They say, after all, most scientists believe in evolution, therefore it must be true. They don't mind using the weight of authority when it goes against the creationist. I am going to the experts in the field, the paleontologists, Niles Eldridge at the American Museum, Colin Patterson at the British Museum of Natural History, Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University, David Raup at the British Museum. These are young or fairly young paleontologists who are now acknowledging the fact that we do not find these transitional forms. After all these many years, in 120 years of intense searching, they are finally now saying we do not find these transitional forms. And may I emphasize again, ladies and gentlemen, if evolution has occurred, if we can find any fossils at all, we have to find transitional forms. Certainly, a tracker who's trying to track someone by his footprints. Maybe a very low probability that a footprint will form, depending upon, of course, the soil. But nevertheless, the tracker will find enough footprints that he can follow the trail. And of course, if evolution has occurred, millions of species gradually evolving through hundreds of millions of years of time, and the idea that we could not find the transitional form, when actually billions and billions and billions of fossils are available, and literally millions are available in our museum, why, of course, that's incredible. The fact is that these younger paleontologists are now frankly admitting that their search has ended in failure. Now, they're not giving up. They're not going to roll over and play dead. They're going to try to modify their theory to predict the gaps. Now, the creationists have been saying all the time the gaps are there. The evolutionists have been saying, no, 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 we got transitional form. Now they acknowledge the gaps are there, so they're going to change their theory to predict the gaps. You can't do that in evolution. Evolution demands change and would produce intermediate forms.
I want to thank Dr. Vincent Sarich, Professor of Anthropology at Berkeley, and Dr. Duane Gish, Associate Director of the Creation Research Institute, for being a part of the program tonight. Did you hear tonight when Dr. Sarich stated that if a particular mutation is desired in a population of 1 million, it would only take 100 years for it to occur? And after all, 100 years in terms of Earth's history is like nothing, right? Well, I'm sure that you realized he was talking about using laboratory facilities. And of course, intelligent doctors and scientists who would direct and watch over such an operation and guide it successfully in each generation over the 100 years. But of course, that's exactly what you would not have at the beginning of Earth's history concerning the evolution of life. Have you heard of C.H. Waddington from the Institute of Animal Genetics in Edinburgh, Scotland? Well, he's written, "It's true to say that we know of no way other than random mutation by which new hereditary variations come into being." Now, random mutation simply means there's no way to control mutations to make them produce characteristics that might be needed. Natural selection must simply take what comes. It doesn't make sense to hold on to the idea that by accident, mutations will produce precisely what is required or needed. The words required, needed, they do not go together with accident. What Dr. Sarich said is simply incredible. Other evolutionary scientists, they say the same thing. In other words, they agree that it's incredible. For example, Dr. Murray Eden, professor of electrical engineering at MIT, in his paper, Inadequacies of Neo-Darwinian Evolution as a Scientific Theory, this is what he wrote about our topic of random genetic mutation. Eden says, "If randomness is taken to mean that a uniform probability is assigned to each possible independent substitution or addition, the chance of emergence of man is like the probability of typing at random a meaningful library of 1,000 volumes. And you use the following procedure." He says, "Begin with a meaningful phrase, retype it with a few mistakes, make it longer by adding letters, and rearrange the sequence in the string of letters. Then examine the results to see if the new phrase is meaningful." Then he says, "Repeat this procedure until the library is complete." Now, I agree with Dr. Sarich that Dr. Gish tonight was just quoting different authorities and playing the old authority game. Now, what he should have done, since he has his PhD from Berkeley in biochemistry and he's worked with, these 3 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, what he should have done is just quoted himself. He should have just told us what he thinks. Just say creation is the only way to go. I think it was unfair for Dr. Gish to quote all those big authorities who are evolutionists. I mean, why go to the evolutionists? I mean, why go to experts? I mean, what do experts know? You know what I mean? I mean, all the experts that Dr. Gish was quoting were just trying to speak as to the nature of the facts. Can they help it if they believe the facts are that transitional forms are not found? I mean, now, that's unfair, isn't it? Dr. Gish, you should have just made up something else. who would have ever thought that he'd go to the experts in each field to quote exactly what they had found?
Well, I certainly agree with Lord Zuckerman that there is no evidence in the fossil record that man has evolved from some lower creature. I believe that these creatures that are found are either apes, monkeys, or men, in spite of the highly speculative transitional form that have been erected on fragments of material. The next slide will show the skull of Australopithecus. This is a very ape-like creature that certainly has for many years been touted as man's ancestor. It is suggested that he walked upright, although he was very ape-like. As a matter of fact, Donald Johanson, his Lucy, he says, is totally ape from the neck up, but yet that creature walked upright. Lord Zuckerman, after many years of research, said no, that creature did not walk upright. He was not intermediate between ape and man. He was simply an ape. Charles Oxnard, who was one of his students, became professor at the University of Chicago and now is professor at the University of Southern California, spent many years of research studying the postcranial skeleton, that is the leg bones, foot bones, hand bones, the pelvis, and so forth, of these creatures. And after all of that research, although he's an evolutionist, he says the evidence indicates that they did not walk upright. They had a mode of locomotion similar to the orang, and certainly not similar to man. Yet we find that creature is being presented as an undoubted ancestor of man, and Dr. Johanson presents his Lucy as our ancestor, which undoubtedly walked erect. And yet other evolutionists says no. Their very careful and thorough analysis shows that those creatures did not walk upright. May we have the next slide, please? Now, on this slide, we see the famous Piltdown man. For nearly 50 years was touted as our ancestor. Turned out to be a 100% fraud, a combination of a modern ape's jaw and a human skull that was doctored up, planted in a gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. They accepted an ape's jaw as an evolutionary form of man. The next slide will show the Nebraska man, reconstructed from a single tooth, which turned out to be a pig's tooth, by the way. Now I say if an evolutionist can get something like that from a pig's tooth, it's no challenge to get something like that from a fragment of an ape or a monkey. The next slide. And we see the earlier pictures of Neanderthal man as a subhuman, primitive forebear of man. As it turned out, his so-called primitive features were due to arthritis and to rickets or a vitamin D deficiency. Today he is classified Homo sapiens. The next slide will show the American Museum version of this creature. The next slide, please. The modern version of Neanderthal man you see is fully human. He's classified Homo sapiens. And so it has gone in the past, where scientists have taken very little and made much out of it based upon their preconceived ideas, and it turned out to be drastically wrong. Australopithecus, our so-called ape-like ancestor, is not our ancestor. He is strictly an ape. And other evidence, Dr. Louis Leakey reported he'd found that creature and a creature similar to the Peking man in the same deposit in his bed 2 in Africa, and underneath in bed 1 and therefore older, he found the remains of a circular stone habitation hut, which is a product of modern man. Now, how can Australopithecus be the ancestor of Homo erectus, which is supposedly, that is the Java man, Peking man creature, which is supposedly the ancestor of man, when first of all we find these two ape-like creatures together and therefore contemporary, and underneath and therefore older, we find the products of modern man. Now that evidence you just don't read in your textbooks today. As a matter of fact, I found it in the first edition of a book by Kelso. His second edition, he'd merely removed it from the book. You just simply forget about evidence like that. I find that the evidence shows, the actual fossil evidence, for example, primates have appeared abruptly. There is no way, as far as a fossil record is concerned, to connect primates to a tree shrew. The scientific evidence is not there. There is no way to connect these so-called first primates to the monkeys. The first time you see a monkey in the old world, the first time you see a monkey in the new world, they are monkeys. The first time you see an ape, he's just distinctly an ape. And in spite of the assumed millions and millions of years of evolution, As Lord Zuckerman has said so very clearly, the fossil record does not produce even a trace of the evidence that would be required if man has evolved from some ape-like creature.
10 seconds.
I think the evidence clearly indicates that indeed man is a special creation. He was not created in the form of an ape, but really was made in the image of God.
When we come back, we're going to hear from a man that did his doctoral work right in this area when we come right back. Dr. Sarich did his doctoral work in this area that we're going to talk about next. Is there evidence that man evolved from the apes?
Well, in recent years, we've been able to add molecular evidence to other lines of evidence, such as comparative anatomy, the fossil record, and so forth, concerning the relationships of organisms to one another. The first slide now shows, and I apologize for the fact we can't blow it up big enough for all of you to read it, more than a few of you, shows you the percent difference in the genetic structure, total genetic structure, of ourselves and our most similar living forms. For example, among human races, there's about 0.1% difference. Human, chimp, gorilla, about 2% different, and so forth, as that slide indicates. Now, one can take those numbers and arrange them into a tree so that when you add up the numbers on the tree, could you flip that thing back again? Right. For example, the difference between, let us say, a squirrel monkey and ourselves is 15%. Now, on that tree, if you add up the numbers, starting from the squirrel monkey, going back to the origin, and then going up to ourselves, we come up with 15%. And in fact, we can distribute these numbers on the tree so that we get the numbers back again. Now, you might say, well, that's obvious you could do that. No, it's not obvious that you could do that. And you could do that only if change had occurred so that these organisms were continually differentiating from one another. And I should ask you a following question, which you might consider somewhat blasphemous, but that's okay. You should ask yourselves that if you were specially created, why were your genes created in the image of those of a chimpanzee or gorilla? Because they are. They're 98% identical. Now let's look at some of the fossils. Next slide. Well, there's some ideas concerning the origin of humans. In one of our recent controversies in California concerning evolution and creation, a cartoonist for the Chronicle suggested that we have a certain hybrid origin. Adam as a gorilla and Eve as a comely human, producing something like Australopithecus, presumably. Now, let's go on. Why don't you just show the slides? Okay. Now, we have living forms. For example, a chimpanzee. Now, at least it doesn't take much of my imagination to see something like that, functionally bipedal, as a reasonable ancestor. You might have more troubles. I don't. Next slide shows a chimpanzee termiting, using a tool, a wetted twig, to fish for ants in a termite mound. Very studious. He's really concentrating on what he's doing. Next one, a rather unhappy chimpanzee. And no troubles empathizing with these organisms. No troubles because the basic biochemistry, the basic brain, and so forth are very similar. Next one. Now, let's look at the fossils. The one on the left is a modern chimp. The one on the right is Australopithecus. That's not fragmentary. That's a complete cranium. What we see is that that cranium is about the same size, implying that it's the same size brain as a chimp. Okay, next one. Here's a back view of another recently found cranium. Again, very chimp-like. In fact, people have looked at this and said, chimp. Go on. However, let's look at the teeth. Here's the dentition of a chimpanzee. And note how the upper canine, that's the projecting tooth, is impacting the first lower premolar. Okay? Now, next slide. Now we look at one of these early presumed hominids. Look at the top tooth. That's a canine. And look at the wear facet on it. In other words, it's honing itself exactly the way a chimpanzee canine would. Next one.
45 seconds.
We'll skip that one then. And, all right, look at these jaws. On the left is a purported hominid. On the right, a chimpanzee. Virtually identical. Next one. So what does one come up with? Well, so what you're saying is, so what? These are chimps. However, when you look at their limbs, a human one on the left, a fossil one on the left, a human one in the middle, a chimp in the middle, a human on the right. The next one. Now you look at two pieces of pelvis that came along with those skulls and teeth. You notice how the backs of those pelvises are tilted over and down, forming a sciatic notch. Next one.
10 seconds.
Ditto for another view, and now you look at the fossils. That looks very chimpy. However, when you put the pelvises together, next one, there's the fossil one on the right, there's the human on the left. Clearly a human-type pelvis, along with a chimpanzee cranium and dentition. What else do you want in an intermediate form?
And it'll be interesting to find out what Dr. Gish responds to that. When we come back, we'll get his response. All right, in response, we have Dr. Gish.
Dr. Sarich has shown you some slides and have asked you, as a layman, to look at these slides and simply decide now, is this creature an ape or man, or is it somewhere in between? Now, Lord Zuckerman says even an expert cannot do that. You can't just look at something and decide. Even if you're an expert in the field, you can't do that. We certainly cannot ask a layman to do that. He says what you have to do is make these sophisticated scientific measurements and tests, so-called multivariate analyses, for example, in which you view the fossil from various angles. And he says when you do that now, you find that this creature, this Australopithecus, or Donald Johansson's Lucy, which Dr. Sarich was showing, that this creature is not intermediate between ape and man, and it did not walk upright. Now, if we see the slide, please. In the upper portion of the slide, on the right, you see the pelvis of this so-called ape-like ancestor of man. On the left, you see the pelvis of an ape. In the middle, you see two human pelves. Now, obviously, the fossil, the one on the right, the so-called ape-like ancestor of man, in that picture, in that view, does look more like man than that of the ape on the left. But Dr. Oxnard, for example, has pointed out if you just rotate that pelvis now and you get the view seen in the lower portion of the slide, now you see the so-called ape-like ancestor of man on the right, the ape on the left, and the two human pelves in the middle. Now you see from that viewpoint, that fossil looks just like the ape and totally unlike man. And so they say, he says, Lord Zuckerman, and Charles Oxnard, Professor Oxnard, says you must take these specimens and rotate them so that you're looking at them from many different angles, many different perspectives. And when you do that, now you find that that creature is not intermediate between ape and man. It is not similar to man. It is more similar to an orang than anything else. Now, if you select your data, select your pictures and your view, of course, you can construct these hypothetical relationships. But when you do the scientific work, when you do it as a scientist should do it, view it from all angles, we find that it does not agree with those conclusions at all. This Lucy of Donald Johansson's, I don't believe for a moment that it walked upright. I heard a lecture by Dr. Owen Lovejoy he was there with Donald Johansson and Richard Leakey and others, and he was describing this Lucy, and it's supposed to be totally ape from the neck up. But he said he performed certain manipulations on the knee joint, and those all proved that it walked upright. That's his visual examination, his visual judgment. Then he did this very complex multivariate analysis where you view the specimen from many different angles, you make many different measurements, feed all the data in the computer. He did that on the knee joint of this Lucy, the knee joint of apes, monkeys, and men, and then he showed the computer printout. The knee joint of Lucy was right in the middle of the apes and totally removed from man, which would indicate that it did not walk upright, that it was similar to that of an ape. What did Dr. Lovejoy say? just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, I guess that data doesn't mean anything. Now, how's that for being an objective scientist?
5 seconds left.
So, I conclude from my own experience, from listening to Johansen and Leakey and others, and from studying what Oxnard and what Lord Zuckerman has said, that these creatures were not intermediate between ape and man. They were simply apes. And as Lord Zuckerman has said, there is no evidence in the fossil record that man has evolved. The evidence indicates that monkeys, apes, and men have each appeared abruptly, fully formed, as we would expect on the basis of creation, but contradicting that of evolution.
3 minutes.
All right, we won't quibble anymore about the pelvis because basically what I said, he just repeated. In other words, if you take two different views of the pelvis, in one view, you get a very human-like appearance. In another view, you get a very ape-like appearance. Now, what does that indicate to an evolutionist? Well, what it suggests is that we are seeing a pelvis, if you wish, in the throes of evolutionary change. That we're getting, if you wish, the things which are fundamental to bipedalism, walking upright first, and then we're getting a certain degree of remodeling. In other words, the rotation of the pelvis so that you see the face of it when you view it head on. This is what you'd expect to see in an intermediate form. Now, I'm sorry that Dr. Gish can't see it as intermediate form, but if we put it up there, if we could show that last slide that I had, now if we could see that slide up there, we've got the modern human one on the left. We've got the Australopithecine on the right. Now, I submit that you don't need any fancy computers to tell you that that thing on the right looks human. It looks virtually as human as the thing on the left. If you don't trust your eyesight that much, you might as well give up. That isn't the only evidence. Let's look at those knees. Next slide. Now what we have there is a chimpanzee on the left, a modern human on the right, and one of the Australopithecines in the middle. Now you notice the chimp leg bones are straight up and down. The axis of the tibia is parallel to the axis of the femur. The human one on the right angles outward. The Australopithecine angles outward even more. Evidence of bipedalism because our femora angle outward from the knees to the hip because of the broadening of our hip. Okay, next one. Look at this knee. A chimp on the left, Australopithecus in the middle, humans on the right. Again, you're looking at the knee bottom up. Notice that the human has a deep groove on the top surface as you see it. That is for our kneecap to fit in. The chimpanzee, not needing a kneecap with a huge vastus musculature attached, does not have that groove. The Australopithecine has a groove, not as fully developed as ours, but surely a groove and a tilt in the same direction as our knee. It is a primitive human knee. Next one.
Time's up. Finish your thought.
Okay. And here we've got some footprints, real bipedal walking footprints. Here's the track going across, and the next one. And here's one of those footprints flat out. That is a human footprint along with a whole bunch of mammals, most of which are currently extinct, and goes along with those organisms whose pelvis I was showing.
I really want to thank Dr. Vincent Sarich, Professor of Anthropology at Berkeley, and Dr. Duane Gish, Associate Director of the Creation Research Institute, for being my guests on the program. You know, I agree with Dr. Sarich that Darwin was wrong in formulating the evolutionary theory. The problem, as I see it, is that which Dr. Sarich now wants to replace the old evolutionary theory with. I think he's looking for this quantum leap in genetic mutations, and I wonder, is that any better than the old Darwinian theory? I mean, now what are we supposed to do? we've all been told time and time again that the evolutionary theory is actually gradual change through time. I mean, we've all been told that we're related to one ancestral form. And I mean, we've all been looking for these transitional forms in the fossil record to support this all along. I mean, now we've got to forget all that, right? Now we've got to join Dr. Goldschmidt and others who suggest a huge leap from a reptile to a bird, a fish to an amphibian. Now we've got to start thinking change in a big way. Suddenly, a reptile is going to lay an egg, and a bird hatches fully formed out of the egg. But of course, if we hold on to that, I think we have a problem with our professors in genetics. You know, if I remember correctly, genetics goes against any quantum leap. I think we were told that if you have a lizard, the genetic apparatus of a lizard is devoted 100% to producing another lizard. Now, the idea that a lizard can lay an egg and a bird will be hatched out of it is absolutely incredible, let alone embarrassing to the lizard. Now, what does a guy like Dr. John Moore, professor of natural science at Michigan State University, know when he says it's significant that without success, genetics has been tried and tried in an effort to produce some evidence of evolution? An experimenter, if he causes an organism to vary, whether it be plant or animal, he always ends up with what he started with. If he starts with bacteria, he ends with bacteria. If he starts with moths, he ends with moths. He may cause all sorts of differences within that kind of organism by the introduction of chemicals and so forth, but he always finds that he is limited to the plant or animal he works with. Now, I mean, those creationists, they just have no imagination. That's what they've been predicting we would find all along. You know, it's so boring. Hey, join me next week when my guests will continue this debate centered around the topic, genetic mutations. What's the scientific evidence for genetic mutations? The podium's up there. We'll ask you these questions, and I'd like you both to comment. All right, first question. Would you say that evolution is a proven fact?
Yes. Absolutely not.
Do you believe that the fossil record gives evidence of intermediate forms?
Yes. No, and we find even evolutionists agree with me on that.
Good, 2 for 2. Those familiar with National Geographic magazine know Richard Leakey, and you folks have probably heard that. He is the discoverer of a 2.8 million year old human skull. Gentlemen, would you agree with Richard Leakey when he said, what we have discovered simply wipes out everything we have been taught about human evolution, and I have nothing to offer in its place?
No, and the date is wrong.
I heard Leakey say that in a lecture he gave in San Diego. If what he said was right, then his implications would be correct.
3 for 3. It is insuperable, or is it an insuperable barrier to say that amino acids could be formed by chance to arrange the exact sequence to form a protein?
Very poor odds.
Poor odds.
Poor odds.
When we view that problem from the laws of probability, we find even the formation of a single protein molecule would be flatly impossible.
All right. As the former chairman of the Division of Anthropology at Berkeley, and as a professor who teaches Anthropology 101, do you believe that your ancestors were apes?
Yes.
All right. Dr. Gish, as you view the evidence of science, would you agree with the theory that it's molecules to man or fish to Gish?
No, I find no scientific support for that proposition.
Has there been enough time for the evolving of all life as we know it today, according to the evolutionary assumptions?
Well, if you think evolution is true, then obviously there has been.
Okay.
Even assuming that the Earth is 4.5 billion years, that would be far short of the required time for evolution to have occurred, certainly by the modern theory. totally inadequate, even 4.5 billion years.
Part of the controversy that we're talking about stems around how did we get the way that we are? And you've heard the word mutation come up a few times, and I'd like the men to address themselves to genetics, mutations, and how life got the way it is.
These comments are a bit more off the wall than the previous ones because the question has been sprung. Now, one of the basic tenets of creationism, as I've heard it expounded by Dr. Gish, is that first, mutations are rare, and second, that mutations are all bad. Well, rare, of course, has to be qualified with how rare is rare. And as I've already pointed out to you, that we can measure mutation rates in a laboratory. We know how to do it. And as I pointed out, if you want a specific base pair change in the DNA to occur, you need a population and 100 years, and you'll get it. Now, 100 years is nothing in terms of the kinds of times that we talk about. What about their badness or goodness? Well, badness or goodness is a relative term. It depends on the situation. I give you an example. We are unable to produce vitamin C. Our answer as to why is that our ancestors were basically fruit eaters. They didn't need vitamin C. Mutations in the vitamin C gene, forming gene, occurred. We didn't need it. Therefore, those mutations weren't selected against. Therefore, we lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C. As long as we remained fruit eaters, that was fine. We got plenty of vitamin C in our diet. Then there was a cultural change, and some of us became sailors. Now, there wasn't fresh fruit on these ships until they figured it out as to why they should have fresh fruit on the ships. And now that mutation, which was innocuous, became bad. Quote unquote. It killed a lot of people from scurvy. Let's take the reverse face of it. Most adult mammals, indeed all adult mammals, with the exception of a few peculiar human groups, such as most of us, cannot metabolize lactose. That is the major milk sugar. That is selectively perfectly logical. Most adult mammals don't ever contact milk, so therefore you don't need the enzyme to work on it. However, when humans culturally developed herding practices, fresh milk became regularly available. Now, any human who was able to metabolize lactose would have an advantage because he could gain more food value out of that continually produced milk. To continue to produce lactose as an adult, all you have to do is knock out that gene which turns off lactose synthesis in the usual normal mammal.
40 seconds.
So, if you get such a mutation, as I said, you only have to wait 100 years in a population of 1 million, you'll get such mutations. Now this mutation becomes useful. It then is selected for, and the frequency increases in those populations that are milk drinkers. And so that we find in human populations that are milk drinkers a very high frequency of lactose tolerance. That is, the ability to metabolize lactose. So whether a mutation is good or bad or an innocuous depends on the context. It is not an intrinsic property of the mutation.
The critically important things we must understand about mutations, as far as this creation-evolution question is concerned, is the fact that these mutations are random. They are accidents. They're actually mistakes. Now, it's a very serious question whether there are any good mutations at all. As a matter of fact, the Nobel Prize winner and evolutionist H.J. Muller said that good mutations are so rare that you might as well just lump all the mutations together and call them all bad. That's how rare the good ones are. Well, as a matter of fact, we've never been able to really demonstrate a good mutations. We've studied the fruit fly for hundreds and hundreds of generations, and using mutations, we get blind flies, and flies that are sterile, and flies that are blind, flies that have no wings, flies that have stubby wings. We get a lot of bad flies. We've never produced a butterfly that way. But the evolutionist, of course, he must have some method of change. You can't have evolution without change, so he must suggest that there are good mutations. Well, he may say they are so slight that they're just imperceptible. You just don't see them. That's what Stebbins has said. Well, let us assume that there are good mutations. Let us assume that there are mutations which changes the animal or plant in some way that it gains an advantage. Now, these good mutations, however, must be produced purely accidentally. They're purely random, just by chance. Now, is it possible, making all the assumptions that evolutionists make, that these good mutations, indeed they do occur, and that somehow they confer an advantage upon an animal so it reproduces in larger numbers compared to the original? Is it possible by this process, where these so-called good mutations now must be produced simply by chance, is it possible to convert a single-cell organism into a man in 3 billion years? Well, when you compare that chance process, it is totally chance now because natural selection can only operate after the mutations occur, and the mutations are produced randomly by chance. Ultimately, then, all of evolution is due to chance. It is a chance process. And mathematicians, taking all of this into account, the idea of chance mutations, natural selection, mutation rates, ratio of good to bad mutations, and so forth, making all these assumptions, comparing this random process of evolution to the laws of probability, have concluded that you could not produce a man or a horse or a moth from a single-cell organism in 5 billion years. You couldn't do it in 5,000 billion years. They said it would take billions of times longer than the assumed 5 billion years of Earth history to do that. So let us make all the concessions to the evolutionist that there are good mutations. But of course, they must be produced by chance. He has nothing but chance. There's no intelligence involved, no purpose, nothing but chance. And even if you make all these assumptions, you cannot get a complex organism in 3 billion years, or even in billions of times 3 billion years. So, conceding these so-called assumptions still does not solve the problem. And I maintain there is no real evidence for good mutations. Why, if there are good mutations, they're so extremely rare that they're hardly, if ever, recognized. And when we think that the mutation rate out of, say, of a population of individuals, say you need a mutation to change a fin into a foot, to change a fish into an amphibian, the mutation rate in those particular genes governing those fins would be, per generation, would be no more than anywhere from 1 out of 100,000 to 1 out of 100 million, good mutations and bad mutations. And surely the ratio of good to bad mutations could not be more than 1 out of 10,000. That would mean, at the most, 1 out of 1 billion of those organisms has a good mutation.
40 seconds.
And somehow, this 1 out of 1 billion is supposed to replace all the original because it has some slight advantage. Well, it would take an enormous amount of time to do that. And then you have only a slight change, and you have to produce millions and millions of these rare chance mutations to convert a single-cell organism into a horse or a man or a moth or something like that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we compare the theory, the scenario, to the actual facts of science, it's not going to happen. We can say with the precision of mathematics that the probability is nil. It does require an intelligent, purposeful creator to account for what we have today.
All right, the next area that we're going to get into is we're going to put both men at the podiums and we're going to turn them loose on each other. They can talk back and forth to each other, and we'll see where that takes us right after this. We've been talking about the scientific evidence that would support the model of creation or the model of evolution. And now it's time to have our professors challenge each other on what they've said or what they think they've been saying. And Dr. Gish, we'll let you start this session.
Dr. Sarich, you showed a picture of what you said were human footprints. I assume these human footprints are indistinguishable from human footprints. Now, my question is this. You say there are human footprints. Did a human make those? Say, like people out here, they're indistinguishable from humans. Did a human make them?
Certainly, the individual or two individuals that made those footprints would be very distinguishable from any of us in the audience, being there's no chimps in the audience. The reason that I say that is that in those deposits, there are plenty of bones. I showed some of them. They are the bones, as we see it, of a bipedal animal with a very small brain. And yes, I would concur with your quotations from Johansen and others that what you had was an animal that was essentially a chimp above the neck and more human below the neck. Not completely.
Well, now, wait a minute, Dr. Sarich, you have a human footprint.
That's right.
Now, why do you say a human didn't make the human footprint? If it's a human footprint, you see an elephant, you say an elephant made it. You see a footprint made by a giraffe, you say a giraffe made it. You got a human footprint. Why isn't it a human that made the human footprint? Isn't it your evolutionary presuppositions that tells you that something besides a human made the human footprint?
We are long past the point at which we can reconstruct a whole organism from a piece of bone or from a footprint or whatever. You would believe that a modern human made that footprint only if either you believe that humans had no ancestors, or second, you had concurring evidence which showed you that there were humans in the rest of their anatomy around there in the fossil record. And there aren't. The things we see in that fossil record are bipedal forms with small brains, overhanging canines, and so forth and so on. Now, if in the fossil record we find a large-brained human, then I change my mind. But to the present time, we have not.
Well, Dr. Sarich, Dr. Leakey reported he found this circular stone habitation hut even older than these things, made obviously by a human. I don't see how we can assume you got a human footprint that there weren't humans around at that time. I still believe.
What is your definition of a human?
A human being, Homo sapiens.
Aha, okay.
Sure.
Homo sapiens.
Yes.
Now, the question is, do we have any fossil evidence of Homo sapiens around at that time? That time is somewhere around 2 million years ago, if you believe that there was a time 2 million years ago, okay? Now, there aren't any Homo sapiens around at that time. That no one will argue about. You won't argue about it because you don't believe there was a time 2 million years ago. And no paleontologists will argue about it because they haven't found any fossils that look modern human, that is Homo sapiens, at that period in time. We do have stone tools. We do have skulls, rest of the skeleton to some extent. And these things are, in our way of thinking, primitive human. They're not Homo sapiens. They're Homo erectus or Homo habilis or whatever you want to call them, but they're not modern. And no one would mistake them for being modern human beings.
Well, Dr. Sarich, you as a younger student certainly are not aware of reports. But there have been reports in the past of the fossilized remains of humans found even in the Pliocene. Sir Arthur Keith in the 20s said there was no reason, no scientific reason to reject these fossils. The only thing is that they're just out of place, and today you don't even read about them. And Marcelin Boula, who went to Peking and studied the remains there on the site of this so-called Peking man, said that those creatures were much too ape-like to have made the tools found on the site. And he said that the hunter who killed and ate those creatures, the so-called Peking man, was actually true men. And so evidently he concluded there was evidence for man that long ago, whatever that long ago may be.
Well, he concluded because he didn't believe that these relatively small-brained creatures could make these neat structures, neat tools, and so forth. That was his belief. However, if you're going to postulate that somebody more advanced killed off these more primitive forms, fine. You can postulate all you want. Doesn't do you any good until you find the fossils. Okay? I mean, we can have imaginary things running around as much as you want, but until you find the fossils, that's what they remain, imaginary beings.
Well, I may make the same charge against the evolutionary ideas, but on the other hand, Eugene Dubois found the Wajak skulls. They're at the same level that he found Pithecanthropus, which is this Homo erectus, or Java man. He found the Wajak skulls at the same level. He kept that fact concealed for nearly 30 years because it's difficult to imagine man, modern man, and these were modern men, living contemporaneously with so-called ancestor of man.
Well, look. First, no one today, as far as I know, has ever suggested that Wajak is contemporaneous with Pithecanthropus erectus, first. Second, if you believe in evolution, then you do have ancestors, or things that are more like ancestors, still around. If, I only say if, we evolved from the apes, that doesn't mean that the apes disappeared. If birds evolved from reptiles, that doesn't mean that all reptiles therefore disappeared. Chimpanzees are still around. Now, I submit that if you went back in time, that around 4 or 5 million years ago, you would reach a point at which the chimps of that time and the ancestral humans of that time would become virtually indistinguishable from one another and ultimately be the same species.
Well, I'll just close my part of this discussion with saying this. Undoubtedly, we found undoubted human tools there near Peking. We have found undoubted human footprints. And even in some cases, there are reports of undoubted human fossils. And I would consider that to be fairly good evidence of the contemporaneous nature of man with these creatures.
We'll jump right in here and take a break and come back for more right after this. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Vincent Sarich, Professor of Anthropology at Berkeley, and Dr. Duane Gish, Associate Director of the Creation Research Institute, for being my guests on the program. In our debate, Dr. Sarich, as an evolutionist, along with other evolutionists, he brought up the fact that many different kinds of animals have similar structures, organs, and metabolism to that of man. Now, is it surprising that the biochemistry, the life chemistry, or the metabolism of the human is very similar to that of a rat? After all, don't we eat the same kind of food, drink the same kind of water, and breathe the same air? To suggest that we both do it is worthless as evidence for evolution. Why? Well, because parrots are able to mimic human speech. That's similar, but that doesn't mean that we're related to them. Creationists believe that similarities are actually the result of the fact that creation is based upon the master plan of the master planner. Where similar functions were needed, God used similar structures and life chemistry to perform these functions. Now, because things are similar, does that prove that they are related? Textbooks today still show sketches of embryos of such animals as chickens, rabbits, and lizards alongside those of men. And they note striking similarities and assume evidence of common ancestry. It could be stated that this proves nothing more than common design by God. Now, is it a standoff? Well, the DNA for the chicken is utterly different than that of the lizard or any other animal, even though this difference is obviously not visual. The distinctive genetic code programmed for each animal assures us that only that kind will develop from the embryo. Superficial, brief similarities are irrelevant to the creation-evolution debate. The fantastically complex design differences in DNA exhibit the work of a master designer. But now even DNA is offered as evidence of evolution. Evolutionists say that the DNA molecule exists in all life and they therefore suggest a common ancestry for us all. But wait a minute. The infinitely more significant fact is that each specific kind of organism has its own particular DNA molecular structure, totally different from that of every other kind. That fact is usually ignored by evolutionists. The DNA molecule is enormously complex and could never have evolved itself by chance. And neither could one type of DNA evolve into the DNA for another type of organism. In fact, its structure is designed to prevent that very thing. It is hard to imagine a more solid case for special creation than DNA. Join me next week when my guests will be debating between themselves and answering questions from the audience. All right, gentlemen, we'd like to have the section here where you discuss the scientific evidence.
Dr. Sarich, according to the evolutionary model, the universe is an isolated system. Now, that does not deny that God exists. It simply says he didn't do anything on the universe. The universe transformed itself from the primordial state, whatever that may have been, the primordial chaotic state, into the present highly ordered and complex universe. So the universe is an isolated system which the evolutionist says created itself. Now, the second law of thermodynamics says, if it says anything, is this, that in an isolated system, order and complexity can never increase. It can only decrease. Now, the evolutionists suggest the universe is an isolated system in which there has been obviously a tremendous increase in order and complexity. The second law of thermodynamics says that is absolutely impossible. How then could the universe have created itself in view of this well-established natural law?
Well, I'll give you a two-part answer, both of which you can consider evasive. As I pointed out in a couple of my pieces, the evolutionists, most evolutionists, don't care, I could use stronger language, don't care really about the origin of the universe. That's the province of cosmologists, if anybody wants to worry about it. It's irrelevant for evolutionary biology how the universe originated. For all that goes, as far as I'm concerned, it's irrelevant for evolutionary biology how life originated. If you want to believe that a creator breathed order into inanimate molecules and that's how life began, I'm not going to argue with you. I don't know any better. All right, I've tried to point that out. That's another one of those topics that I trust I have the wisdom not to worry too much about because I don't know the answers and I don't know how to get the answers. And I've also pointed out that there is a perfectly good creation model around, which was published in 1857 and derived from a suggestion made in 1822, which is in absolutely impeccable agreement with any evidence that has been found and any evidence that will be found. And if you want to believe that kind of creation, I'm not going to quibble. What I do quibble about, and most strongly, is when you start talking about creation of all the various lines that we see in the fossil record. Then I say, no, the evidence either is that you believe that this occurred in God's mind, or the Creator's mind, and we're just looking at that plan, or that it occurred in real time. And those are indistinguishable propositions. Okay. So they're not problems.
Well, there seems to be no argument on that point.
That's
As a matter
right.
of fact, it's flatly impossible. I'll turn the podium over to you, Dr. Sarich.
What is flatly impossible?
That the universe could have created itself in view of the second law of
Well,
thermodynamics.
now that's another issue. That's another issue.
Oh, no, it's not.
Now, when we come
It's science.
to the second law of thermodynamics, if we want to wallow in that area, I'll wallow for a little while.
Is the universe an isolated system?
Yes.
All right. The second law says an isolated system can never increase in order and complexity.
No way.
That's what it says.
Now, wait a minute.
Oh, yes, that's what it says. Pick up a book on thermodynamics, and you'll find that they say This is what the second law of thermodynamics says, that an isolated system, order and
wait a
complexity
minute.
can never increase.
Wait a minute. I've read at least as much physics as you have, okay, and physical chemistry and all that other stuff. The universe, I don't know if the universe is an isolated system. I really should say that. We don't know that. But let's assume that it is. Then we come down to the question of how did the universe originate? All right? Now, there are various models around for that origin. One of those models says that at some, and I'm not saying that I believe this or disbelieve it, I'm just saying this is a model. Just as the idea that the universe is an isolated system is a model. One of those models says that at some time in the distant past, we had a very compressed body of matter. This begs the question, as I've mentioned, of where the matter came from originally, okay? And it got so compressed that it blew up. That's the Big Bang theory. And then these particles spread out from one another for a long time. But in that spreading, they are not independent, isolated bodies, because there's a little matter of gravitational attraction, which attracts all pieces of matter to one another, as far as we know. Okay? Now, these things are spreading apart from the initial impetus of the Big Bang, but they are still held together, quote unquote, by gravity. Ultimately, the force imparted by the Big Bang is spent. And then gravity takes over, and things start coming back together again.
20 seconds.
So, it's not an isolated, it's an isolated system in one sense, but it surely is not an isolated system in any other. It's, in the usual way of looking at it, kind of a rubber band going back and forth.
It is undoubtedly an isolated system. There's no creator external to it. Nothing did any work on it. It did it all itself. It's an isolated system, Dr. Sarich. It created itself, and that is impossible in the light of the second law of thermodynamics. You cannot have any system like that start in a state of chaos or disorder and then up in a state of order.
It didn't start in chaos or disorder.
And on that note, we'll come back and get questions from the audience right after this. If I can just get back.
Dr. Sarich, if mutation is the vital ingredient to the evolutionary process and no radical improvement in physical function occurs without it, why is it that every effort is made today to reduce or eliminate our exposure to mutagenic sources?
Such as X-rays?
X-rays, cosmic radiation.
What, would you repeat the last portion of the question?
Why is it, since that mutation is the mechanism by which evolution occurs, why is it that every effort is made today to reduce or eliminate our exposure to mutagenic sources?
In other words, if mutations are so good for you, why don't we just have more of them? In essence.
In other words, why, you know, we're all protected from X-rays for a reason.
That's
we don't
right.
want to have mutations from X-rays.
Right. Let's consider this question from the perspective of the way an evolutionary biologist might look at it. Now, what we do observe in all forms of life is that mutation rates are very similar in all forms of life. It is difficult to look at that and not suggest that that rate itself is controlled by natural selection. We do know that we can knock out certain protective systems in the human body and in those of other species and increase mutation rates radically. When we do that, the individuals tend to die of cancer. Okay? And the point is that the body is in very fine tune, apparently, so that the mutational input, without which evolution couldn't occur, is maximized up to the point where there aren't so many mutations that any two genes, any two gametes coming together wouldn't each carry a lethal. And those coming together would kill every offspring. As it is, it's estimated that something like 40% of all human conceptions die before coming to term, precisely because they are genetically programmed to die.
Okay, we're running out of time. Dr.
Couldn't
Gish,
afford much more of
would
that.
you respond to this as well?
Yes, I'd like to respond to that. Obviously, evolutionists have a dread fear of the slightest increase in the mutation rate. And as suggested, if evolution occurs by mutations, then why don't we speed up the mutation rate and speed up evolution? Of course, the fact is, these mutations are just bad. That's all. They are all bad. And evolutionists, for example, would fear that the slightest decrease in the ozone screen, because if if that did decrease, then we'd increase the mutation rate, and that's bad. I had the same question asked of Dr. Harvey Bender of Notre Dame University, who's an evolutionist. And he answered the question this way. The question was, why don't we speed up the mutation rate? And that should be good. He said, well, let me illustrate it this way. He said, I'll lay my watch here on the floor, and I suspend an ice pick above the watch, and I drop the ice pick. Now, the chances that ice pick is going to improve the works of the watch is just as great that a mutation is going to improve a cell. Well, then I went to the podium and said, Dr. Bender, then how in the world can a mutation ever cause evolution if the chances that that mutation is going to improve that cell does not exceed the chances of dropping an ice pick on a watch is going to improve that cell, the watch? How in the world can evolution ever occur in the first place? Obviously, there just isn't any answer.
Mutations,
We're going to have one
don't
more
cause
question here.
evolution.
Can anybody that starts with the impersonal and comes down, impersonal plus chance plus time, give us any meaning to existence where we're at?
Well, I like to think so.
How?
What? Why do you need the support of something that you can't see, feel, recognize, or anything? Why? Dr. Gish once at one of our excursions into debate read a description of a secular humanist. Isn't that right? And I got up and I said, that description fits me perfectly. And if you like it, fine. If you don't like it, fine. I don't see any difficulties in equality, or any other particular human virtue or sin, okay? I see no difficulties in support for that or being against it purely in a human context. I see no necessity for support from the supernatural.
Would you say, Dr. Sarich, that the Chinese communist or the Cambodian or the Cuban or the Russian sees anything immoral about his point of view, or would you see anything immoral about his
I would
point of
certainly
view?
see plenty immoral about their points of view, yes.
Well, why? I mean, they're basing their ideas of what's right and wrong and morality on their particular
So the Inquisition was based
existentialist
on
viewpoint.
the Inquisition was based on somebody's viewpoint of what morality was.
That's the whole thing, though. Like, I had a Jewish exchange student on whose father was killed in Nazi concentration camps. And I said, you know, do you feel that Hitler was wrong? And I said, what if I just tell you that Hitler actually loved the Jewish people and wanted to get them to their eternal reward a little quicker than everybody else? He really believed that. Who's to say he's wrong?
Well, if you believe that, I mean, it's very easy to get yourself to your...
Okay, that might be the extreme, but the thing is, what we're saying is there are no absolutes for anybody. It's all simply predisposition. It's only what you choose. And who's to say that your choice is any more right than Hitler's when there's no absolutes? And you have to have an infinite reference point for that.
Let me put it this way, okay?
I'd like to hear it.
Okay, let me just give an answer. If I had a choice, okay, which I currently do, maybe not in this audience, but in the country as a whole. If I had a choice between a morality based on some recognition of fundamental laws based in, I'm not good in the words here. Come on, you people know. What word do I want? As givens, okay? From above, if you wish. If I had a choice of that, as opposed to a morality which is human-based, with no reference to anything beyond humans. Given human history, I would certainly choose the latter over the former.
That's true, and I guess that's where we disagree.
That's right.
What can we say at the conclusion of this debate? I'd like to go back to Darwin himself, first of all, where he wrote, about fossils he wrote, "By this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth?" Or, the eminent L. Harrison Matthews, the British biologist and evolutionist, in his introduction to a 1971 publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, points out, in accepting evolution as a fact, how many biologists pause to reflect that science is built upon theories that have been proved by experiment to be correct, or remember that the theory of animal evolution has never been thus proved. The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Even the outspoken and convinced evolutionist Thomas H. Huxley wrote, "Creation in the ordinary sense of the word is perfectly conceivable." Listen to the conclusion given about evolution by G.A. Kirkuk in the international series of monographs on pure and applied biology, entitled Implications of Evolution. G.A. Kirkuk is the chairman of the Department of Physiology and Biochemistry at Southampton University. This evolutionist concluded from the evidence, the first assumption of evolution was that non-living things gave rise to living material. What did he conclude? He says that this is still just an assumption. He says the second evolutionary assumption is that biogenesis occurred only once. His conclusion is that, again, this is a matter for belief rather than proof. Third, the evolutionary assumption that viruses, bacteria, protozoa, and the higher animals were all interrelated. His conclusion is, we have as yet no definite evidence about the way in which the viruses, bacteria, or protozoa are interrelated. He says the fourth evolutionary assumption is that the protozoa, that is one-cell organisms, gave rise to the metazoa, that is multi-cell organisms. What was his conclusion? Again, he says, nothing definite is known. The fifth evolutionary assumption he writes about is that the various invertebrates, the ones with no backbone, are interrelated. His conclusion, the evidence then for the affinities of the majority of the invertebrates is tenuous and circumstantial, not the type of evidence that would allow one to form a verdict of definite relationships. The sixth evolutionary assumption is that the invertebrates, organisms with no backbone, gave rise to the vertebrates, those that had backbone. His conclusion is that this is a matter of belief as to which way the evidence happens to point. He quotes Barrow, who says, in a sense, this account is science fiction. The seventh evolutionary assumption is that the fish, amphibia, reptiles, birds, and mammals are interrelated. He goes on to explain that the dating is of utmost importance here, and that we do not have a completely reliable method of dating the fossils. Therefore, he concludes, the evidence that we have at present is insufficient to allow us to decide the answer to these problems. Then he states, in effect, much of the evolution of the major groups of animals has to be taken on trust. There is a certain amount of circumstantial evidence, but much of it can be argued either way. Where then can we find more definite evidence for evolution? He suggests that it might be possible to show that the present-day forms are changing, and the evolution is occurring at this level. But he continues, of course one can say that the small observable changes in modern species may be that sort of thing that led to all the major changes. But what right have we to make such an extrapolation? We may feel that this is the answer to the problem, but is it a satisfactory answer? A blind acceptance of such a view may in fact be the closing of our eyes to yet undiscovered factors which may remain undiscovered for many years if we believe that the answer has already been found. He then makes a further comment. It seems that at times that many of our modern writers on evolution have had their views by some sort of revelation. It is premature, not to say arrogant on our part, if we make any dogmatic assertion as to the mode of evolution of the major branches of the animal kingdom. He finally concludes, and remember, he is a solid evolutionist. The general theory of evolution and the evidence that supports it is not sufficiently strong to allow us to consider it as anything more than a working hypothesis. When all has been said and done, is it really so hard to affirm with our astronauts? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.